There's a question that spans centuries of philosophy, theology, and logic, and which to date has not found a definitive answer that satisfies everyone. It's a simple question in form, but devastating in content. A question that, depending on how you look at it, can shake entire foundations of religious beliefs, philosophical systems, and even your own way of understanding what it means to be powerful. The question is this: can God create a stone so heavy that not even he can lift it? If you've never really stopped to think about it, perhaps your first reaction is to laugh. It seems like one of those childish riddles that children use to try to beat adults in arguments. But don't be fooled by the simplicity of the question. Serious philosophers, brilliant theologians, and rigorous logicians have spent lifetimes trying to find an elegant way out of this problem, and most have come out the other side with more doubts than when they entered. Because the stone question isn't really about stones. It's about the limits of the unlimited. It's about what happens when you push a concept beyond the boundaries that logic can sustain. Let's start at the beginning, understanding exactly what is at stake here. The theistic tradition, especially in the great monotheistic religions, such as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, asserts that God is omnipotent. This word, omnipotent, comes from the Latin omnis, which means all, and potens, which means powerful. Omnipotent, therefore, means all-powerful. But what exactly does this mean? Does it mean that God can do everything? Absolutely everything without exception? If so, then God can create this impossible rock. And if he can create it, then he cannot lift it, which means he is not all-powerful. But if he can't create the stone, then he's not all-powerful either, because there's something he can't do. Do you see the problem? No matter what answer you give, you seem to be saying that God is not omnipotent. And this is what makes the Omnipotence Paradox so disturbing. It is not an external attack on the idea of God. It arises from within the very definition of God. It's like an autoimmune disease of theological thinking, where the system attacks itself. Now, before continuing, it's important to understand that this problem didn't arise yesterday. It has deep roots in the history of philosophy. One of the earliest known versions of this paradox appears in the writings of medieval thinkers who attempted to reconcile faith with reason. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theologians in history, faced versions of this problem in the 13th century. Aquinas was a man of extraordinary intellectual sophistication, and he did not simply dismiss the problem. He tried to solve it. His solution was to say that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do logically impossible things. For Aquinas, saying that God cannot create an unliftable stone is not a limitation of divine power. It's simply recognizing that the concept itself doesn't make sense. It's like asking if God can make a square round. The answer is not that God is too weak to create round squares. It's just that round squares simply don't exist as a logical possibility, so there's nothing there to be created. This seems reasonable at first glance. And for centuries, this answer satisfied many people. But the problem is that it opens up another box of complications. If God is limited by logic, then is logic more powerful than God? Who created the laws of logic? If God created them, could he have created them differently? And if he could have created them differently, then the logic is not necessarily true. It is just the logic that God chose, which means that our rational demonstrations of necessary truths would not be all that necessary. This problem was explored in a fascinating way by the philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes came to a conclusion that many found shocking. God could have created a universe where 2 plus 2 were not 4, where the triangle did not have 3 sides, where the mathematical truths that we consider eternal and necessary were different. For Descartes, divine omnipotence was so absolute that not even logic could escape it. God was free from the bonds of human reason. This seems to solve the stone problem at the cost of making human knowledge deeply unstable. If God can change the rules of logic whenever he wants, how can we trust anything we think we know? But let's return to the central paradox. More modern philosophers have attempted to formalize it in more precise ways. The argument goes something like this. If a being is omnipotent, then it can perform any task. Creating an immovable stone is a task. Therefore, an omnipotent being can create an immovable stone. But if a being created an immovable stone, then there is something he cannot do, which is move that stone. Therefore, this being is not omnipotent, and if he cannot create the immovable stone, then he is not omnipotent either. In either case, the being cannot be omnipotent. This argument is formally valid. This means that if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. The question is whether the premises are true, and this is where things get really interesting. One of the most sophisticated responses to the paradox comes from the analytical tradition of philosophy, especially the work of philosophers such as Alvin Plantinga, one of the most rigorous religious thinkers of the 20th century. Plantinga and others argue that the paradox is based on a conceptual confusion about what omnipotence means. The version he and others defend is that omnipotence means the ability to bring about any state of affairs that is logically possible. And creating an immovable stone for an omnipotent being is, by definition, logically impossible, because immovable means it cannot be moved by any power, including that of the one who created it. There is something satisfying about this response, but it does not completely close the debate, because it seems to assume that we know in advance what is and what is not logically possible, and that these boundaries are fixed and independent of God. But if God is the creator of everything, including logic, then this position becomes difficult to support. There is also another version of the problem that is even more disturbing. Instead of talking about stones, some philosophers formulate the paradox in terms of moral actions. Can God create a situation that he himself is unable to resolve morally? Can God create a being with free will that chooses evil in a way that God cannot prevent without violating that free will? And if God cannot stop evil without violating free will, then he is not omnipotent. But if he can stop evil without violating free will, then why doesn't he? This branch of the paradox connects to the problem of evil, which is perhaps the greatest philosophical challenge to theism. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, why is there suffering in the world? The standard answer, free will, finds a limit when we realize that children die of cancer, that earthquakes kill thousands, that diseases devastate entire populations. None of these evils seem to have anything to do with the free choices of human beings. And then the question of omnipotence comes back with force. If God could avoid these things and he doesn't, either he is not as powerful as he says, or he is not as good as he says. But let's take a step back and think about the stone paradox in a different way. What if the problem was not with God, but with the concept of omnipotence itself? What if omnipotence was simply an incoherent concept, regardless of who we were trying to apply it to? This is the line taken by some philosophers. They argue that omnipotence is not a property that any being could have, because the definition of omnipotence inevitably leads to contradictions. If this is so, then saying that God is omnipotent is not describing a real quality of God. It's using a word with no coherent meaning. And this would have enormous implications for theology. The philosopher George Mavrodes, writing in the 60s, made an interesting observation. He said that the paradoxical stone, an immovable stone for an omnipotent being, is not really a stone. It is a pseudological object, something that seems to be describable in words, but that does not correspond to any real possibility. It's like the expression, the largest integer. It seems like it makes sense, but any mathematician knows that there is no such number, because for any integer you name, there's always a larger one. The problem is not in the universe, it is in language. And Mavrodes argues that the stone paradox is similar. It's not a problem about God, it's a problem about how we're using words. This is comforting to theists, but it does not completely solve the problem. Because even if we accept that language is causing confusion, we still need to explain why language creates this confusion specifically when we try to describe God. If the concept of omnipotence inevitably leads to contradictions, doesn't that say something important about what we are trying to describe? Let's explore a different perspective now, one that comes not from Western philosophy, but from Eastern traditions of thought. In Buddhism and certain currents of Hinduism, the very idea of an omnipotent supreme being is viewed with skepticism, not necessarily because such a being could not exist, but because the category of being does not properly apply to what is ultimate and absolute. The Buddhist concept of sunyata, the void, or the Hindu concept of nirguna Brahman, the attributeless absolute, suggests that what is truly ultimate is beyond predications, such as powerful or non-powerful. Trying to apply human categories like omnipotence to the absolute would, in this view, be a fundamental categorical error. It would be like asking, what is the color of love, or what is the weight of justice? This perspective is philosophically fascinating because it dissolves the paradox in a completely different way. Instead of trying to save the concept of omnipotence by reformulating it, it simply says that the whole concept was wrong from the start. What is divine, what is ultimate, what is sacred, is beyond the categories the human mind uses to organize experience, and trying to apply these categories to the divine inevitably leads to absurdities like the stone paradox. But here we have a dilemma. If God is completely beyond any human description, then how can we say anything about him? How can we pray, worship, have a relationship with something that is beyond any predication? Apophatic theology, negative theology, dealt with this by saying that we can only describe God through what he is not. God is not limited, he is not temporal, he is not spatial, he is not subject to the laws that govern the created world. But this path also has its limits. If God is nothing that we can describe, in what sense is he anything? The paradox of omnipotence is not just a theological problem, It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of logic, language, and the limits of human thought. When we reach the extremes of thought, when we try to think the absolutely infinite, the absolutely perfect, the absolutely powerful, we inevitably encounter structures that seem to contradict each other. This is not necessarily a fault of the universe. It could be a failure of the cognitive tools we are using to explore it. Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century German philosopher, argued that human reason has a natural tendency to go beyond the limits of possible experience and attempt to make claims about what lies beyond those limits. He called these errors antinomies of pure reason, contradictions into which reason falls when it tries to think the infinite, the absolute, the beginning of time, the limits of space. For Kant, the Omnipotence Paradox would be an example of this type of problem. It is not that God is contradictory. It's just that our reason is constituted in such a way that when it tries to think about the divine, it inevitably falls into contradictions. This is deeply humiliating, in a way. It means there are limits to what we can think, not just what we can do or perceive. There are cognitive boundaries beyond which reason begins to fold in on itself, like a map trying to map itself. And the paradox of omnipotence is one of these boundary points. But there is another angle to this problem that is rarely explored, and which I find particularly fascinating. The paradox presupposes that being able to do everything is better than being limited to doing only what is coherent. But is this true? Think of a music composer. Part of what makes composition possible is precisely the existence of restrictions. Musical scales, rhythms, harmonies, tensions, and resolutions. If a composer could make any sound in any combination without any structure, the result would no longer be music, it would just be noise. Restrictions do not diminish creative power. In many cases, they make it possible. Some theologians argue that God, in creating a universe with coherent logical and physical laws, was not diminished by those laws. He chose them as the framework within which creation would become possible. And within that framework, he remains the most powerful being in existence. The idea of an absolutely unrestricted power, a power that could even violate logic, is not a grander idea of God. It's a more confusing idea, which in the end doesn't describe anything coherent. There is also a psychological dimension to this paradox that is worth exploring. Why is the idea of omnipotence so attractive to us? Why have human beings, in so many different cultures throughout history, projected onto the divine this specific quality of unlimited power? One possible psychological answer is that omnipotence represents the complete denial of our own powerlessness. We are radically limited beings. We don't control when we are born. We don't choose our initial body or mind. We can't avoid growing old or dying. In the face of this radical contingency, creating an omnipotent God is a way of affirming that absolute power exists somewhere, even if not in us. It is a response to the fundamental fear of powerlessness. If this is true, then the omnipotence paradox is not just a logical problem. It is a mirror that reveals something about ourselves, about why we need powerful gods, about what that need tells us about our own nature. And the inability to formulate a coherent concept of omnipotence may invite us to think differently about what we seek when we seek the divine. Maybe what we really want is not power, but meaning. Don't be control, but connection. Don't be a being who can do anything our thing, but a being that is present in everything. Returning to the pure philosophical argument, there is a more recent version of the paradox that brings additional complications. Contemporary philosophers such as Peter Geach distinguished between unfettered omnipotence, the ability to do absolutely anything, and what he called almighty omnipotence, which is having power over all things. For Geach, no being could be omnipotent in the unrestricted sense because this would inevitably lead to contradictions. But that wouldn't be a problem for religion, because what religion really needs is the second kind of power, supreme power, over the created world. A God who has absolute power over everything in creation, even though he cannot do logically impossible things, would still be worthy of worship and powerful enough to be the God of the great religions. This distinction is useful, but it still leaves open questions. Because religious traditions often assert more than that God has power over the created world. They assert that God is the source of all reality, that God created the world out of nothing, that God necessarily exists, and that everything else exists contingently. These claims are stronger than simply having the greatest power within the universe, and it is in relation to these stronger claims that the omnipotence paradox bites hardest. There's a 20th century thinker who approached this set of problems in a way that I find particularly illuminating, Alfred North Whitehead, the founder of process philosophy. For Whitehead, the idea of an omnipotent God in the traditional sense is not only logically problematic, but also morally problematic. A God who has absolute power and control over everything is a God who would be responsible for everything that happens, including suffering and evil. Process theology, on the contrary, proposes a God who is not omnipotent in the sense of having control over everything, but who is omnipotent in the sense of having the greatest possible persuasion, the greatest possible love, the greatest possible presence in all reality. This God cannot make a stone unliftable simply because this God does not operate through coercion or brute force. This God operates through love, attraction, persuasion. And a being that operates in this way is subject to limitations, not out of weakness, but out of respect for the autonomy of what exists. There is something profoundly beautiful about this vision, even if it also raises its own philosophical questions. The paradox of omnipotence forces us into an uncomfortable and at the same time fascinating position. We do not have a definitive answer that completely satisfies. The available answers involve redefining what it means to be omnipotent, accepting that logic limits God, embracing the idea that the divine is beyond human categories, or radically revising the concept of divinity. Each of these routes has its own philosophical costs. But maybe that's exactly the point. Perhaps the function of the paradox is not to be resolved, but to be inhabited. Being used as a tool that forces us to think more rigorously about what we mean when we use words like God, power, infinite, absolute. Paradox is like a bone that the mind cannot swallow and cannot spit out. And sometimes it is precisely in these moments of cognitive impasse that the deepest thinking happens. Theodor Adorno's Negative Dialectic, one of the most dense philosophical works of the 20th century, argues that the strength of thought lies precisely in its ability to sustain contradictions without resolving them prematurely. Forcing an easy synthesis where there is genuine tension is a form of intellectual betrayal, and the Omnipotence Paradox is a case where the tension is genuine. Any resolution that is too quick should raise suspicion. Think about the following. If you are reading about this paradox and feel like you have an easy, clear answer that solves everything elegantly, you probably don't fully understand the problem. Not because you are less intelligent, but because the problem is genuinely difficult, and any solution that seems simple is almost always hiding a complexity that reappears later. What we can say with some confidence is the following. The concept of omnipotence as the unrestricted ability to do absolutely anything is incoherent. This is not necessarily an attack on God. It is an attack on a specific concept of God that has perhaps not been formulated with sufficient philosophical care. The great religious traditions have the resources to reformulate the concept of divine power in ways that avoid the most obvious incoherence. But these reformulations have costs. Either they limit God's power in ways that some people find theologically unsatisfactory, or they embrace a view of God as so beyond human reason that it becomes difficult to say what it means to have a relationship with that being. And this is where the Omnipotence Paradox comes into play, in something that goes far beyond theology. He reminds us of the limits of our own thinking. It reminds us that the language we use to describe the world has boundaries, and that when we try to describe what lies beyond those boundaries, we inevitably end up with contradictions or silence. Wittgenstein, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, ended his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with a phrase that became famous: what one cannot talk about, one must remain silent. There's a version of this insight here. Perhaps the divine is precisely that which we cannot speak about with full coherence, not because it does not exist, but because it is beyond what human language can encompass. This is not necessarily an invitation to total silence. It is an invitation to humility, to the awareness that when we get to the deepest questions, when we try to think about the absolute, the infinite, the eternal, the omnipotent, we are in territory where the usual tools begin to fail, where the map no longer covers the territory, and where intellectual honesty demands that we admit this limitation, rather than pretending we have answers we don't. The paradox of omnipotence does not resolve the debate about the existence of God. It does not prove that God does not exist, but it proves that thinking about God seriously requires much more care than we generally assume. It requires us to confront the possibility that the categories we use to describe the divine may be inadequate for what they are trying to describe. And that, in itself, is an important philosophical discovery. There is something deeply human about this situation. We are the species that asks questions, that goes beyond the immediate, the concrete, the given, in search of meaning, origin, and foundation. And when we get to the more radical questions, like what is God, what is being, what is nothingness, we discover that we are creatures who reach the limit of their own capacity for understanding, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of the nature of what we are trying to understand. The paradox of the stone is ultimately an invitation to think more carefully, to speak more humbly, to live with more openness to mystery. Not mystery as an excuse for not thinking, but mystery as the legitimate and honest frontier of human thought, where words fail, where logic folds in on itself, where certainty dissolves, not necessarily meaninglessness begins, but perhaps the deepest of senses, the one that cannot be captured in propositions, but that can be lived, intuited, contemplated. And if that seems unsatisfactory, if you wanted a clear and definitive answer to the paradox, then consider that dissatisfaction as part of the answer. Because perhaps the greatest wisdom a human being can achieve is the clear and lucid awareness of what they do not know. Socrates knew this 2,500 years ago when he said that his only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing. The paradox of omnipotence is one of the many doors that lead us to that very place, to the very center where intelligence finds its own limits, and if it is brave enough, learns to inhabit that place without terror, with curiosity, with respect, and perhaps with something that can only be called wonder.